The night was drenched in silence, broken only by the rustling of dead leaves and the slow drip of rain sliding from bare branches. Midnight had cast its veil across the forgotten graveyard at the edge of town, where crumbling gravestones leaned as if weary from centuries of watching the living betray one another. A sleek black car rolled in, its headlights cutting through the mist, then extinguished with a sharp click. Out stepped Adrian Blackwood, his tailored suit already damp from the drizzle, his jaw clenched as though holding back years of rage. He yanked open the back door, revealing the fragile body of Elena, his pregnant wife, unconscious from whatever he had given her to make her silent. Her pale face glistened under the dim light of the moon, strands of wet hair plastered to her cheeks. Adrian's hands tightened on her arms as he dragged her across the muddy earth, her white dress soaking with dirt and rain. She was so still, so vulnerable, yet within her, life stirred, the faintest kicks of a child she would never let him claim. Adrian leaned down, his lips brushing her ear, but his words were not tender. They dripped with venom, heavy with resentment. "You've ruined me, Elena. You've tied me down with this burden. You were supposed to be my perfect wife, but all you've done is chain me. Tonight, I cut those chains." His voice cracked with bitter satisfaction as he let her body slip onto the ground, her head resting against the jagged edge of a weathered stone. Thunder groaned in the distance, and the rain thickened, washing over her like the earth itself wept for her. Her chest rose faintly, her heartbeat fragile yet steady, and within her womb, her unborn child responded with a subtle kick, as if refusing to give up. Adrian glanced once more, his expression unreadable, then straightened his coat, climbed back into the car, and started the engine. The roar of the machine shattered the quiet, then faded into the night as he sped away, convinced he was finally free. But the graveyard held its secrets well. In that place of death, a whisper of life still remained. By day, Adrian Blackwood was the very image of success, a man whose name adorned magazine covers and charity galas, whose smile seemed to radiate confidence and benevolence. He had built his empire from the ground up, or so the public believed, pouring his fortune into real estate projects that reshaped skylines and investments that brought him admiration from both politicians and businessmen. Cameras loved him, and society worshipped him. Adrian, the visionary, the philanthropist, the man with the golden touch. Behind the velvet curtains of his glittering reputation, however, lay a truth so vile it would shatter the carefully polished illusion. In his private world, Adrian was not the polished gentleman he projected, but a man gnawed by greed and driven by ruthless ambition. He cut deals in the shadows, siphoning money through offshore accounts, bribing officials, silencing rivals, and leaving a trail of ruined lives in his wake. Every smile he offered the public was just another mask. Power was his true religion, and control his most sacred prayer. He relished bending people to his will, his employees, his partners, and above all, the women in his life. That hunger for dominance had led him to Selena. She was everything Elena was not, seductive, calculating, and venomous, with beauty sharp enough to cut. Where Elena had once offered him loyalty and warmth, Selena fed his ego with poison-laced sweetness. She whispered into his ear at night, her words intoxicating, her touch igniting the darker cravings within him. Selena saw herself not as his mistress but as his rightful queen, the one who should stand at his side as he conquered the world. But in her eyes, Elena was an obstacle, a fragile figure clinging to a place she no longer deserved. Selena never hid her disdain. "She makes you weak, Adrian," she would hiss, her voice smooth as silk yet edged with malice. "Every time you return to that house, every time you see her swollen with your child, you lose a piece of yourself. If you truly want to rise, she must be gone." Adrian, drunk on her influence and his own thirst for liberation, let her words take root. His empire might have been built on steel and stone, but it was Selena's whispers that pushed him toward the decision that would soon unravel it all. Elena had never imagined her life would turn into a gilded cage. She came from a modest family, raised with values of kindness and humility, where love was measured not in riches but in moments of warmth and honesty. When she first met Adrian, she had been swept away by his charm, his grand gestures, the way he made her feel like the center of the universe. To her, he had been a dream, a man who promised a future of security and love. She married him with hope in her heart, believing she had stepped into a fairy tale. But fairy tales, she learned, can rot beneath the surface. The Blackwood mansion was a palace of marble floors and crystal chandeliers, yet it felt colder than stone to Elena. Its endless halls echoed with silence, a silence that deepened whenever Adrian turned his back on her. The servants moved quietly, but their eyes followed her, pity laced in their glances. She was no longer the radiant bride she once was. Now she was the invisible wife, eclipsed by another woman's shadow. Selena's presence in the mansion was unbearable. Bold and venomous, she paraded her dominance openly, wearing Adrian's attention like a crown. She would sit at his side during dinners, laughing too loudly, reaching for his hand, her glances toward Elena sharp as knives. Elena endured it in silence, her head held high even as her heart splintered. She refused to let them see her break. Yet despite the cruelty, a flame of strength burned quietly within her. She would place her hand on her swollen belly, feeling the small kicks of the child who gave her purpose. In those moments, she whispered promises to her unborn baby, that no matter what shadows surrounded them, she would fight to protect the life within her. The servants, loyal in secret, whispered among themselves. They pitied Elena, admired her grace, and quietly questioned Adrian's cruelty. In hushed tones, they began to doubt the man they once revered, sensing that beneath the mansion's glittering surface lay darkness too heavy to ignore. Morning came heavy and gray over the Blackwood mansion, yet the emptiness inside its walls was heavier still. Elena's chambers were silent, her bed cold and untouched. The servants, accustomed to her quiet presence, sensed something was wrong when she did not appear for breakfast, nor did the soft sound of her footsteps echo in the hallways. Whispers began almost instantly, hushed voices passing through corridors like a current of unease. Elena Blackwood was gone. Adrian appeared unaffected, sipping his morning coffee with calculated calm as though nothing unusual had occurred. When questioned by the staff, he gave a dismissive wave, his voice laced with contempt. "She left," he declared. "She was unhappy, unstable. Couldn't handle the pressures of this life. She's gone, and good riddance." His tone was sharp, his story rehearsed, and yet beneath his arrogance lay the faint trace of nerves. Selena, seated comfortably at the breakfast table, smirked at the explanation, her eyes sparkling with cruel delight. She played her role well, echoing Adrian's claims with false sympathy. "Poor Elena," she said, her voice dripping with mock concern. "She always was fragile." Her satisfaction was thinly veiled, her smugness only fueling the quiet distrust that simmered among the household staff. The servants did not believe a word. They had seen Elena's resilience, her quiet dignity in the face of humiliation. Unstable? No. Silenced? Yes. Rumors traveled quickly, reaching Elena's family, who grew alarmed at the sudden disappearance. They knew their daughter, knew she would never abandon them, never vanish without a word, especially not while carrying a child. Fear clutched at their hearts, and they reported her missing. Local police opened an investigation, but their efforts quickly faltered. Adrian's influence stretched far, his wealth and connections buying silence. Officers who asked too many questions found themselves reassigned or quietly pressured into closing their files. The case, like so many others touched by Adrian's reach, seemed destined to fade into dust. Yet fate had other plans. While local law enforcement stumbled, the FBI's attention was drawn not by Elena's disappearance, but by the tangled web of Adrian's financial empire. Inconsistencies, offshore transfers, and whispers of fraud put Adrian Blackwood under a different kind of scrutiny. And soon, one agent would see the missing wife not as a footnote, but as the key to unraveling everything Adrian had built. The name Adrian Blackwood had already been floating through FBI channels long before Elena vanished. His financial empire was too vast, too polished, and too carefully guarded to be clean. When millions shifted overseas with no clear trail, when construction projects linked to his companies bled money into shell accounts, red flags rose. Yet it wasn't until Elena's sudden disappearance reached their ears that the case gained urgency. Agent Daniel Carter was the one who connected the dots. Known among his colleagues as relentless, Daniel had a sharp eye for lies and a personal disdain for men who hid behind power. He read the reports about Adrian, the missing wife, the whispers of bribed officials, the silenced investigation, and he knew something more sinister was buried beneath the surface. To the public, Adrian was still the untouchable philanthropist, a man who gave to hospitals and charities. But Daniel saw through the illusion. The timing was too perfect. Elena vanished just as Adrian's financial irregularities came under closer inspection. It wasn't coincidence, it was strategy. Adrian thought removing her would leave him untethered, free to maneuver without the weight of scandal. Daniel studied photographs of Elena, her kind eyes, her hand resting protectively over her pregnant belly. She was more than a name on a file. She was a woman abandoned, perhaps silenced, and Daniel could not ignore the humanity behind the crime. "Find the wife, find the truth," he muttered, pinning her picture to the center of his board. From that moment, Elena's disappearance was no longer a family tragedy swept aside by money and influence. It became federal business, a case woven into fraud, betrayal, and the dark heart of a man who believed himself untouchable. For the first time, Adrian Blackwood had drawn the attention of someone he couldn't buy off. The cold dampness of the earth pressed against Elena's skin as she stirred, her eyelids fluttering under the weight of unconsciousness. The air was heavy with the smell of wet grass and soil, and when she finally managed to open her eyes, the jagged outlines of gravestones loomed above her. For a moment, confusion clouded her mind. Where was she, and why was she lying among the dead? Then the memory returned like a knife. Adrian's voice, dripping with hatred, his hands dragging her through the mud, his promise that she had ruined his life. Her body ached, every muscle protesting as she tried to shift. A sharp pain coursed through her abdomen, and she gasped, clutching at the swell of her stomach. Then, faintly, like a fragile spark in the darkness, she felt movement. A kick. Her child was alive. Tears welled in her eyes as she whispered hoarsely, "I'm still here, we're still here." The night pressed in around her, the rain pattering on broken stone. She thought of Adrian, the man she had once loved, and the cruel betrayal that had left her discarded like nothing more than a burden. Yet even through the grief, she found herself clinging to a single thread of strength, survival. If not for herself, then for the tiny heartbeat within her. A sound startled her, a shuffle of boots over wet grass. Panic seized her until she saw the dim glow of a lantern approaching. It was the graveyard's old groundskeeper, a man with weathered hands and eyes that had seen too much sorrow. He froze when he saw her lying there, then hurried to her side, his voice low and urgent. "Dear God, what happened to you?" Elena tried to answer, but her words dissolved into sobs. The man helped her to her feet, his coat wrapped around her trembling frame. Though she was weak, a fire flickered in her chest. She had been abandoned in a place meant for endings, but she refused to let it be hers. Somewhere deep inside, she knew her story, and her child's, was not finished yet. Adrian sat in his study, the fire crackling in the hearth, but the warmth did nothing to soothe the unease gnawing at him. His whiskey glass trembled slightly in his hand as he replayed the night over and over. He told himself it was finished, Elena was gone, buried in silence, and the world would accept the story he had crafted. Yet doubt crept in, sharp and persistent, like a thorn beneath his skin. The FBI's sudden presence unsettled him more than he cared to admit. Questions were being asked, polite at first, but with an edge he couldn't ignore. Agent Daniel Carter had visited the mansion once already, his gaze steady, his tone calm yet probing. Adrian had handled men like him before, buying their loyalty or bending their will, but something about this one felt different. He did not flinch, did not seem swayed by wealth or charm. It was as if Daniel could smell the rot beneath the polished surface. Selina was no comfort. Instead, she fanned his paranoia, mocking his hesitation. "You should have made sure," she taunted, her lips curling into a smirk. "Men like you can't afford loose ends. Are you certain she's gone?" Her words burned deeper than the whiskey. He snapped at her, insisting he had taken care of it, but her laughter lingered, slicing at the edges of his pride. Outside the walls of the mansion, whispers grew louder. Servants carried their doubts, investors hesitated, journalists sniffed at rumors of both Elena and Adrian's crumbling empire. For the first time, Adrian felt the fragile grip of his control slipping. The empire he had built on power and fear was beginning to tremble, and no matter how much he tried to silence the noise, he could feel it closing in. Selena thrived on the chaos that unsettled Adrian. Where others might have feared the crumbling edges of his empire, she saw opportunity. Draped in silk and jewels he had bought her, she would lean lazily across velvet chairs, sipping wine with a smirk that made Adrian's blood boil. She was beautiful, yes, but it was the kind of beauty that cut, sharp, cold, and dangerous. To her, Adrian was not a man to be loved but a prize to be controlled. She stroked his ego when it suited her, whispered poison when his confidence wavered, and reminded him that without her, he was nothing more than a frightened boy in an expensive suit. "You let her haunt you," she sneered one evening, her voice low and mocking. "That pathetic wife of yours, she clings to your empire even in her absence. Do you know what weakness smells like, Adrian? It smells like you." He tried to silence her with threats, but she only laughed, her eyes glittering with cruelty. What Adrian did not realize was that Selena was already preparing her own escape route. She had been speaking to rivals, men eager to see Adrian fall, and dropping hints about his crumbling stability. If his empire collapsed, she intended to survive it, and profit from it. In truth, she was more dangerous than Elena had ever been. Where Elena's strength was quiet resilience, Selena's power was venom, and she was ready to strike the moment Adrian faltered. The breakthrough came quietly, almost by accident, but it was enough to shift the case from suspicion to certainty. For weeks, the FBI had been combing through Adrian Blackwood's movements, piecing together his financial dealings alongside his wife's disappearance. Agent Daniel Carter, unwilling to let the trail grow cold, pushed harder than anyone else. His persistence finally paid off when a grainy surveillance video surfaced from a traffic camera near the old graveyard. The footage showed Adrian's luxury car slipping into the outskirts of town late at night, headlights cutting through the mist. Hours later, the same car was seen leaving, its tires splattered with mud. The timing was too precise, too damning. Daniel replayed the clip again and again, watching the shadowy figure of Adrian step briefly into view. "There you are," he whispered, certain now that Elena's fate was tied to that night. The next piece came from a local witness, an elderly man who often walked his dog near the cemetery. He recalled seeing a figure dragging something heavy from the back of a car under the cover of rain. At first, he thought it was refuse, but when the FBI pressed, he admitted it looked like a woman. His voice trembled as he described the scene, guilt in his eyes for not having intervened. Forensics soon followed. Adrian's car, though meticulously cleaned, revealed traces of blood beneath the lining of the trunk, blood that matched Elena's DNA. A fragment of jewelry, one of her earrings, was discovered lodged under the seat, overlooked in his haste to erase the evidence. It was enough. Daniel assembled the pieces into a case that no bribe could bury. A warrant was being prepared, the walls tightening around Adrian Blackwood. Yet Daniel knew this was only the beginning. Finding Elena was the key, and with every lead pointing to the graveyard, hope flickered that she might still be alive. Elena's world had shrunk to the shadows of the graveyard caretaker's shack, a place that smelled of damp wood and old soil. The man who had found her, whose name was Samuel, treated her with a gentle care that surprised her. He brought her food in secret, a blanket to keep away the chill, and never once pressed her for details she wasn't ready to give. "Rest," he would say softly, his weathered hands adjusting the lantern so its glow reached her without drawing attention from outside. Each night, Elena felt the sharp ache of betrayal sink deeper, yet alongside it grew a stubborn fire. She could not allow herself to be consumed by despair, not when the tiny kicks inside her reminded her that life still clung fiercely to her. Sitting on the narrow cot Samuel had offered her, she whispered to her unborn child, "We will survive this. You and I, we will not let him win." Days blurred into nights, but her strength slowly returned. Samuel eventually helped her send a discreet message to her family through an old friend who owed him a favor. The words were simple, almost cryptic, "I'm alive. Don't stop looking." But it was enough. That message found its way into the hands of investigators, and soon into the files of Agent Daniel Carter, whose suspicion of Adrian Blackwood deepened tenfold. For Elena, survival became not just about hiding, but about preparing. She thought often of Adrian and Selena, their cruelty pressing on her like a weight. The pain of knowing the man she once trusted had left her to die could have broken her, yet she clung instead to the strength she discovered within herself. She began to imagine a future where her child could be born free of Adrian's shadow, a life where she was no longer silenced but finally heard. Meanwhile, the FBI's growing investigation brought whispers into the caretaker's shack. Samuel's contacts carried news of Adrian's empire unraveling, of agents circling closer. Hope flickered in Elena's heart. She was not merely a victim waiting to be found, she was a survivor waiting for the right moment to step out of the shadows and reclaim her voice. Adrian's confidence began to erode the moment he caught wind of whispers that Elena might still be alive. At first, he dismissed it as nonsense, the gossip of servants or the lies of enemies eager to watch him unravel. But then came the subtle hints, questions from the FBI that cut too close, lingering looks from Daniel Carter that suggested knowledge Adrian couldn't explain away. The thought gnawed at him, what if she had survived? What if Elena, the woman he had left for dead, was somewhere out there, watching his empire crumble? Selena seized upon his unease like a predator scenting blood. "I told you to be thorough," she hissed, pacing the study in her silk gown. "You're slipping, Adrian. A man in your position can't afford mistakes." She should have been nothing more than a memory. Her scorn sharpened with every word, pushing his fragile pride closer to collapse. Her taunts only deepened his paranoia. Adrian began lashing out at everyone, investors, servants, even Selena herself when her laughter cut too deep. But beneath the anger was fear, cold and suffocating. He imagined Elena's face appearing in court, her voice dismantling the life he had built, her child born as living proof of his betrayal. The FBI's presence grew heavier, each day closing the noose around his neck. Daniel Carter was asking too many questions, circling too close to the truth. Adrian realized he had no choice. If Elena was alive, he had to finish what he started. With grim resolve, he began making preparations, his mind set on the graveyard once more. This time, he promised himself, there would be no mistakes. The graveyard was cloaked in fog the night Adrian returned, its silence broken only by the crunch of his polished shoes against the wet ground. He carried with him the weight of desperation, a man no longer in control but clawing to reclaim it. His eyes darted through the darkness, searching for her, convinced Elena had somehow cheated death and hidden herself among the shadows. Elena was there, waiting, though not as the frightened woman he had abandoned. The caretaker had warned her Adrian might come, and though her body trembled with fear, she refused to run. Standing among the crooked gravestones, she wrapped her arms protectively over her belly, summoning courage from the tiny life within her. When Adrian's figure emerged from the mist, her voice cracked through the stillness. "You'll never touch our child." Adrian's face twisted, rage and disbelief colliding. "You should have stayed buried," he snarled, stepping closer. "You've ruined everything, Elena. Everything." His hand reached inside his coat, the glint of metal catching the moonlight. But he was not alone in the graveyard that night. The FBI had been trailing him, Daniel Carter leading the charge. From the shadows, voices rang out. "FBI! Drop it, Blackwood!" Followed by the sudden chaos of movement. Floodlights pierced the fog, agents closing in from every side. Adrian, cornered, raised the weapon, his eyes wild. For a heartbeat, Elena thought it was the end. Then gunfire shattered the night, controlled, precise. Adrian's arms snapped back as agents disarmed and restrained him, his empire collapsing in that single moment. Elena sank to her knees, tears spilling freely, relief flooding her chest. She was alive. Her child was alive. And the man who had tried to bury her was finally in chains. The trial of Adrian Blackwood became a spectacle, the fall of a man once celebrated as untouchable. Courtrooms overflowed with reporters eager to capture every detail, their cameras flashing as the polished image of the millionaire philanthropist was stripped away piece by piece. Prosecutors laid bare his empire of fraud, the bribes, the offshore accounts, and finally, the chilling attempt on his wife's life. Elena, fragile yet resolute, testified with quiet strength. Her voice trembled at first as she recounted the night he abandoned her in the graveyard, but steadied when she spoke of her unborn child and the will to survive. The room was silent as she described waking in the mud, clinging to life while the man she had once loved drove away without a second thought. The servants who had watched from the shadows also took the stand, their testimonies painting a damning picture of Adrian's cruelty and Selina's venomous role in his schemes. Even Selina herself, facing charges of conspiracy, turned against him in court, her betrayal sealing the coffin of his defense. When the verdict came, guilty on all counts, the once mighty Adrian Blackwood sat hollow and pale, his empire reduced to rubble, his name forever tarnished. Life in prison awaited him, stripped of wealth, stripped of power, stripped of the illusion that he had ever truly been in control. For Elena, justice was not just a verdict. It was freedom. Freedom from the chains of betrayal, from the mansion that had been her cage, and from the shadow of a man who had tried to erase her. With her child still safe within her, she walked out of that courtroom into the light of a new beginning. Years later, the scars of betrayal remained, but they no longer defined Elena. Time had passed gently, and in her arms she held the living proof of survival. Her child, now growing into a bright-eyed symbol of everything Adrian had tried to destroy but failed. The boys' laughter filled the modest home she had built for them, a stark contrast to the cold silence of the Blackwood mansion. Every smile he gave reminded her that even in the darkest places, life had found a way. Elena often thought back to the graveyard, to the night she had been left for dead among broken stones. What once was a place of despair had transformed in her memory into a place of rebirth. She visited it sometimes, standing in silence as the wind rustled through the grass, her child's hand in hers. To him, she would tell the story, not of hatred, but of resilience. "We came from shadows," she whispered, "and we chose the light." Adrian's name had long since faded from headlines, a forgotten relic of greed and cruelty. His empire, dismantled, was little more than a cautionary tale in business circles. Selina too had vanished into obscurity, swallowed by the same darkness she once wielded. None of it mattered anymore. What mattered was the future Elena had carved out, one built on love, courage, and the fierce will to protect her child. On quiet evenings, as her son drifted to sleep, Elena would look at him and feel peace. He was not just her child, he was hope, living proof that even in betrayal, life could bloom. And though the shadows of the past would never fully vanish, they had taught her something invaluable, that even in the darkest graveyard, there is always a chance to rise again.